learners, and welcome to the physiology of our first organ system, the nervous system. So neurophysiology, which we get to learn about in this lecture, is how our body talks to itself. And our focus for this lecture is going to be first getting some details about the nervous system and its functions, and then understanding the tissue of the nervous system, which is neuron. And then finally, we get to learn a lot more about how we actually send and receive signals through the plasma membrane of neuron. Okay? That means we got to learn about ions, sodium, potassium. We have to understand the resting membrane potential. And so learning about the plasma membrane of neurons is going to be very important for us. Then, once we learn about what the plasma membrane is, normally we get to see how changes in the plasma membrane are allowing us to move those signals down to other parts or other neurons in the nervous tissue, and also therefore to other parts of the body. And so the change in the membrane potential is going to be very important, and that's going to lead us to graded potentials, which are going to be short distance messages, and then action potentials, which are long distance messages. And those action potentials have to literally travel in one direction. And how they travel in one direction is going to help us understand refractory period and the propagation of those action potentials. So here we have an image of an overall nervous system. We have two organizations of the nervous system, which is going to be the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. That's all going to be all about our different nerves throughout the body. Get into some nervous system functions. So the nervous system is our body's command center. It's going to control all of our bodily functions, but it doesn't do it by itself. It needs to be able to receive messages and send out messages. And so the nervous system is going to be able to respond to changes both automatically. That means it's happening out of your own control. You're not consciously doing it. And again, consciously. That means you actually are aware, and you have some control. So for example, I'm moving my pen around the screen. I'm actually controlling and saying, hey, I want to move my hand around, versus my heart beating. Well, that's something that's out of my control, is happening automatically. So how does this all work? Well, the entire nervous system is going to work by, again, sending and receiving electrical messages between the brain and the body. So how does it do that? It's broken up into two different parts. You have the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, and then you have your peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is going to be all the nerves and ganglia inside the actual body that's going to be bringing messages to the brain and spinal cord. And of course, after the brain and spinal cord process everything, those messages can then go back to the peripheral nervous system so that we can cause some type of movement, for example, both consciously and automatically. Now, here's some general functions of the nervous system. First, the nervous system has the ability to control breathing, movement, speech, and vision. So you can just always say, well, how am I forming words right now and speaking to you? That is going to be the nervous system. And also, how do I adjust my tone? If I'm telling you this, this, and this, or I can say I'm telling you this, and this, and I'm changing my tone of voice, that is the nervous system. How do I understand to walk upstairs? That is the nervous system. Okay? Also, it monitors internal and external conditions and determines responses. So what does that mean? We care about homeostasis. That's really the crux of physiology, right? That means we have to have some type of receptor, control center, and of course effector to help us be able to maintain all of our bodily functions. And guess what? The control center for a lot of bodily functions is going to be, or majority of bodily functions is going to be the nervous system. And mainly the brain, right? That's what we think of. But I always say majority because the spinal cord also has the ability to be the specific focus if we're talking about reflexes. For example, if you're like, okay, my blood sugar is lower, I know I'm actually hungry, and now I'm going to eat some food because of it, excuse me. That is your nervous system. It also is going to regulate complex processes like thoughts, memories, and emotions. So for example, you are solving a math problem. That's something your nervous system is going to work with. But also you may have negative feelings around math because maybe your fourth grade teacher came at you wrong. Well, guess what? You can have negative feelings when you're solving a math problem, and therefore you can end up impeding how you're actually growing through that process, which is why sometimes you see people talk about growth mindset to help you kind of break out of some of the systems you may have been inundated with as a child. And then finally, it also manages involuntary actions like blushing, sweating, and blinking, all the different portions that are going to be a part of the autonomic peripheral nervous system, which we'll get into later. And so really what we're looking at here, your body's ability to say, hey, there are certain things that I can't consciously control on my own. I can't just think of them in my brain and say, heartbeat, 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 or blink, blink, blink. No, it needs to happen naturally. So, and on its own and function on its own. It doesn't need to be conscious. And that's where that involuntary action is going to come from. Okay? So overall, the central nervous system is going to process and decide info, and the peripheral nervous system is going to carry information to and from the central nervous system. So sends to, and also the central nervous system will integrate and decide, and then send information back to the peripheral nervous system to make movements happen, or of course, things happen automatically. Saying, wait a minute, there's a lot of different functions for the nervous system. How do I organize myself? And just to remember, just to let you all know, remember, I'm structuring my lectures like I've done before for the first exam using that study guide. So you want to make sure you're looking at the study guide, and I'm using the lecture to help answer some of those questions so you don't have to do extra work outside of the lecture. Okay, folks? But like I was saying, if you want to organize yourself and say, okay, there's a lot of functions, a lot going on, what can I do to kind of simplify all this? Then you can focus on 3 key functions of the nervous system, which is going to be sensory input, integration, and motor output. Those are the 3 ones we're going to focus on. So the nervous system is going to receive, integrate, and respond to information similar to the basis of our homeostasis cycle. So remember our good old homeostasis cycle? We have that little kind of teeter-totter, and you know you had to deal with some kind of stimulus, which is going to help us. Let me go ahead and erase that. We had a stimulus that was going to help us, of course, start to trigger receptors, right? So we had a stimulus. That stimulus is going to trigger the receptor. That receptor is going to send a message afferently, or meaning towards the actual brain, which is going to be our control center, for example. The control center is going to integrate that information and figure out a way that it wants to respond. So then it'll go through an efferent pathway and exit the brain to go to the effector. An effector will then create a response. So remember that little graphic that we had? It was like you had a little teeter-totter here, and then you're going from whatever your stimulus and receptor was all the way to your response, all based on your external environment. But this also is based on your internal environment. And yes, that was the basis of our homeostasis, and guess what? That's one way we can understand the nervous system as well. So of course I want to give an example of all this, but first let's look at what they give you in your textbook just so we can orient ourselves. So first it says you have sensory receptors, right? You have a receptor. That means this person has photoreceptors here in the retinol that's going to be able to look at a glass of water and say, oh, I want that glass of water. I'm a little bit thirsty, right? That sensory input is going to go through an afferent pathway. If you're thinking of different pathways of how you're arriving to the brain or the control center, you can think afferent means to arrive. So sending a message to arrive at the brain. Then the second portion is going to be integration. How do you process and interpret just being able to see that glass of water? So that message is going to go to the brain, which is therefore going to be our control center here. Okay, and this is going to control visual and, of course, whatever you're going to do as far as movement and motor. So the brain's going to say, okay, we see a glass of water, we need to pick that glass of water up and we need to drink. But it doesn't just happen. The brain has to then say, I'm going to send a message out. Where am I going to send your message out to? The muscles, and that's going to go through an efferent pathway. So you can think E for exit, A for arrive at the brain, E for exit the brain. And it's going to exit the brain until it gets to an effector. Okay, so the effector will be your arm and your hand, and of course the muscles that are going to be in your arm, etc. So you have your effector here, and then that effector is going to receive the message from the control center or the integration area and say, okay, we need to make sure that we have a movement. What is the movement going to be, or what is the response going to be? You're going to reach and you're going to pick up the glass, and of course you're going to drink. So that's what that last little bit of motor output is. It's going to travel again via the efferent pathways to the effectors that cause that response. And so you pick up the cup and you drink. I'm going to take the same little pathway and speak about it as a physiologist. So that means in reference to homeostasis. So for example, yes, you have a receptor that you're going to be looking at that water from, and that can be where your sensory input comes from, right? But what kind of stimulus could you have as well? Could your throat be a little bit dry? And you're like, I definitely need some water. Could you have a situation where internally in your body, your blood is low on water, or your blood is too salty, signaling that you will need water, and so therefore you want to be having your osmoreceptors, for example, instead of just having your photoreceptors? You could have osmoreceptors, osmo for osmosis, in the body that's saying, hey, we got blood that's too salty. We are low on water right now, right? And then that message from that stimulus is going to go through afferent pathway to the control center, which is going to be the brain, to turn on your thirst release hormone. Okay, so it's going to say, hey, we got some hormones that we can release to say, hey, we are thirsty. What's going to happen? It's going to go out to normally your kidneys or your skeletal muscles, and it's going to say, hey, you need to get a drink. So sometimes it'll be your kidneys just make sure it's producing or getting more water out to your body, or a lot of times it'll be a motor output like you see here, where your muscles is like, pick up that glass of water, I'm thirsty, okay? And then what's going to happen? You drink the water as a response to your effector, and you're going to increase the amount of water in the body, and so your salt to water ratio in your cells go back to normal. That's another example we can use. So I always like to say, let's always have an example for stuff when you're starting to look at this. Yes, you can look at the book, but I want you to start adding on and say, okay, as a physiologist, as a junior physiologist, how would I start adding in more details when it comes to homeostasis of this? Because you'll notice that those same 3 key functions of the nervous system is very similar, like I said, to our overall cycle for homeostasis. You can shorten this or make it as long as possible. As you can see with the homeostasis one, it's a little bit longer. There's more details about the names of the receptors, etc. And because we're at the beginning, that may be a little bit difficult. But as we go along, we start getting more details with chapter 13, and we start understanding sensory receptors. It's going to become more easy for you, okay? But here's another simple example if we want you to go and just keep it clear. For here are more simple. You see a red light, your brain interprets it, and your foot presses on the brake. That's another thing that, again, is going to help fulfill those 3 key functions of the nervous system. Now let's talk more about the organization of the nervous system, because again, yes, you don't have to know every single piece, but having the general landscape is going to help us. Let's move on to that. The organizational nervous system is extremely important. So how is it all organized? Of course, we break it up into 2 main parts. We have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is going to be all the nerves, the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and all the neuroglia that's going to be surrounding to support these nerves. And so, yes, those are very long sometimes because we need to make sure we're getting messages from our brain to the bottom of our pinky toe, right? So we got a lot of detail that we have to do. And so when you're looking at the peripheral nervous system, yes, it's a lot more components to it. Because remember, this is the portion that's going to be carrying information to the central nervous system and also receiving messages from the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system needs to be able to make those connections. Biggest questions I always get from a lot of students is, well, if we've got all these long, weird nerves that are going throughout our body to send signals, how do we get the signals so fast? How do they happen so fast? Well, it has to do with your cell. It has to do with your cytoskeleton and your mitochondria within your cell. One thing that we don't go over because it's a lot more detailed than the course allows, but your cells do emit a weak amount of light. And we know that light travels very fast, so that's one of the reasons why we can get messages to our central nervous system and also messages move from our central nervous system through the peripheral nervous system in a quicker manner. All right, let's focus on our central nervous system. So this is going to be our integration and control center. So we're talking about that homeostasis cycles, control center. If we're talking about the 3 key functions of the nervous system, it is the integration portion. And guess what, folks? Yes, we always normally see the brain as the main part for integration, but the spinal cord is very important as well. The brain is for things that need a longer time to interpret and process. The spinal cord is going to be for more fast reflexes, and we're going to be able to learn about reflexes as well as we go along. And so that's going to be something that the spinal cord is going to be able to mainly be focused on because it's going to be quicker to get to the spinal cord than it would be to travel up to the brain. Okay? But let's focus on our peripheral nervous system, our PNS. This is where all the communication lines linking the central nervous system to the body is going to be. And there's 2 different portions of the peripheral nervous system, the sensory part and the motor part. And that makes sense because we saw sensory and also motor output be a portion of those 3 key functions of the nervous system, right? So the sensory is going to be something that's going to be responding to everything that is around you inside the body and also in your environment. And it's going to be sending signals to the central nervous system, right? And so there's different parts of it. There's going to be your somatic, which so soma means body, so just keep that in mind. Down there. It's going to be your somatic portion, and also your visceral sensory fibers from your internal organs. To keep the central nervous system constantly informed of what's happening inside and outside the body. That's very important. So a lot of folks, it's like easier for them to remember the sensory portion. But then there's also the motor division. And the motor division is then more categorized into two smaller portions called the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So remember I was telling you there's different parts of the nerve functions is going to be happening automatically and then consciously. This is where in the peripheral nervous system that is broken down, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about the motor division. And as you can see, the motor division means that this is the signals or messages that are coming from the brain and being sent to the rest of the body. So these are commands that come from the central nervous system. Whereas when you talk about the sensory division, that's going to be commands that are being sent to, or information and messages being sent to the central nervous system. So let's keep that in mind as well. So one thing you can say is that sensory is going to be our afferent, motor is going to be our efferent. Arriving to the central nervous system, exiting the central nervous system. That's another way to break it down. Okay? Somatic nervous system is going to be voluntary. So that means this is our skeletal muscles. So if I'm going ahead and I'm dancing and I move my arms around, that is conscious, that's voluntary. Okay, if I'm basically picking up weights and doing bicep curls, that is also voluntary. So that's where that somatic nervous system is coming from. And as I am moving around, remember, I'm consciously doing it. So I'm literally saying, I want to be able to move my arms and dance my arms around if I need to. So I'm sending that message to the central nervous system, to the brain to then bust my moves, right? But when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, that is going to be involuntary control. So these are some organs and our glands. So what that means is control it consciously. And that auto means self. That means it's happening without having to need that overall input to the actual central nervous system at that point. It's going to be like, hey, the central nervous system can detect changes, and then those changes again will send messages in an efferent pathway to the autonomic nervous system on its own. Okay, folks, and we'll get an example of that. Now, the autonomic nervous system is then broken into two more parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So when we're thinking of the sympathetic nervous system or the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, that's going to be our good old fight or flight response that we're used to hearing, okay? So fight or flight means that, say somebody's attacking you, you're like, okay, am I going to fight it out or am I going to run? It just depends on what type of, effect your body will have in those moments. And it's different for everyone, right? So when you have something like fight or flight, and we're thinking of how our overall body responds to this, then your brain and your central nervous system will say, okay, I have an increase of heart rate. Maybe your pupils are dilated and you are going to slow digestion in your body because you don't want to be focused on spending energy digesting when you're trying to fight or flight, right? So that's going to be kind of how your sympathetic autonomic nervous system works. And this happened, again, on its own. It's a reaction that you're having. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which means that you're dealing with mainly rest and digesting. It's conserving energy at this point. And para means alongside or besides, right? So that means if I'm going through the fight or flight response, there's going to be a time where I need to rest as well and get back to digesting. So again, if we are increasing our heart rate here for fight or flight, the parasympathetic system, after the whole process is done, is going to decrease the heart rate, constrict the pupils, increase digestion. So you have this position where it's like, okay, before I wasn't focusing on digestion, I slowed it down, but now I'm in the rest and digest state. I can actually begin digestion and putting my energy in other areas to help my body calm back down after that flight or fight response. Now, there's other responses that we're not talking about, like being in shock, but that's something separate. Let's think of some other examples of the autonomic nervous system. So, for example, cardiac muscle is autonomic. We don't need to, once again, tell our body consciously, beat, 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 beat. We need our heart to beat on its own. Also, our smooth muscle in our gut and our blood vessels, that's autonomic. We don't want to make sure that we're saying, hey, push this food down. Make sure it's actually digesting. No, we need that to happen on its own. And then our glands, like if you have to sweat, you have saliva or different hormones, that's going to happen autonomically as well. You don't want to have to wait to tell yourself to sweat. If that's the case, you're not able to cool your body down well enough. So just keep those things in mind when it comes to the overall nervous system, the organizational nervous system, and hopefully this helps. Our next focus is going to be in the next video. It's going to be learning more about neurons, and then we are going to be moving on into the plasma membrane. See you there, folks.